Podcasting. Anyone ever thought about having a podcast? Where do I start? Where do I begin? Here's a tip for you, something that I use, Anchor. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It is absolutely free, and they provide all the creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your computer, phone, tablet, whatever device you have. It is super convenient, and Anchor will even distribute your podcast for you. Your podcast can be on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Grow your listeners and get as many people as possible to listen to your podcast. Everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Let's do it.
Shows are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Welcome to the Edventures in Tech podcast. Talking the latest tips and trends in educational technology to innovate and engage your students. Here are your hosts, Andrew and Dan.
Welcome to episode 39 of the Adventures in Tech podcast. Hey, Dan, you know what really grinds my gears?
Oh, I can start my list right now. Don't get me going.
Oh, once again, we're excited you're joining us on episode number 39, Dan. 39. Can you believe 39?
Yeah, we're catching up to your age.
That's true.
We still got a while to go for my age.
I'll say we'll surpass mine. We'll be working on yours. Anyways, if you like the content, like us, help us out by providing feedback and a rating on wherever you download your podcast from. We greatly appreciate your support. Lots of things going on. We have a special guest today that we will get to in a little bit. Classroom updates, just still the 3D printing we talked about with that. We're doing that good PBL project with our STEAM specialist that we had mentioned. With Central Hudson. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of moving and shaking.
Right. I'm ready to move and shake in the podcasting a little bit more. We had some great opportunities come our way, so I'm looking forward to exploring those some more.
Yeah, so that'll be great. And then, of course, ISTE is happening in Philadelphia 2023. Discover Your Next. We'll put a link in the show notes where you can learn about that, or you can just Google it, whatever works for you. And then there is another conference that we found actually local to us. It's the New York State Education, Information, and Technology Conference. It's happening April 19th through April 21st, 2023, and it's at Mohonk Mountain House. So
nice.
Definitely in our backyard, something you can check out as well. We'll put the link to that. So they actually call it the NEAT conference, right? So
yes.
I don't know where the NYSAIS comes from.
And they say their target audience is school librarians and technologists. I think a lot of people fall under that.
I agree. The
technologist
thing. I think anybody who's
I
into it.
am proudly a technologist.
Yeah. Well, but I think even like classroom teachers who are really embracing the use of technology in their classrooms, this is something that you could definitely check out. The schedule's not out yet. We just got the dates. It'll be the Wednesday through the Friday of April at Mohonk Mountain House. So that's something that you can definitely check out. We'll put the link to that. Now, Dan, I know we're not going to go over too much weekly wind-up news.
Well, we have a guest.
We do have a guest. I just wanted to say, I'm going to post the link to this. AJ Giuliani, who I know we talk about a lot, and, we got to get him on the show. That's next.
We'll try.
But, yeah. He put a blog post up about whatever it is, you have to be meaningful and relevant. And it's based off his book, right? With engaging learners in an age of distraction, which as educators, I know we all can feel that pain, right? We've all been there and experienced that. And it really grinds my gears. But, the best part was, I'm not going to read the whole blog post. We'll just post the link to it. It reminds him of the Calvin and Hobbes comic that, I feel is a lost art.
My favorite comic. I have Calvin and Hobbes books, the comics.
These kids don't know these comics anymore because how many of them are getting into the Sunday papers? I don't even know. I don't even get the Sunday paper, I'll be honest. So are there comics still in there?
There are.
There are. Okay, so I gotta get my subscription back. So basically it says, Calvin, your mom and I looked over your report card and we think you could be doing better.
But I don't like school.
Why not? You like to read and you like to learn. I know you do.
I mean, you've read every dinosaur book ever written and you've learned a lot, right? Reading and learning are fun.
Yeah.
So why don't you like school?
We don't read about dinosaurs. There you go.
There you go. That fits my son to a T.
Yeah, exactly. It does. That's Cam right there, not Calvin. So here's the thing. Kids still love learning when learning is meaningful and relevant. And that's going to be like our little soapbox moment, for the day, for this episode. As far as other weekly wind-up news, you can now import presentations from Google Drive into Quiz-Is Lessons. So it's a single click. So as long as you allow the access, you can check it out. We will put the the blog post with all the GIFs, right?
The GIFs.
The GIFs are in there from Quiz that you can check out.
I like what Quizzes is doing. The import, your Google Forms going right in, now your presentations, and they do have a really robust platform for engagement for students for that formative assessment. So.
Right. And talking about formative assessment, if you don't have tech, which we talked about this, I don't know, a couple episodes ago, but let's talk Plickers real quick. If you don't know what Plickers is, go to plickers.com. We're going to put the link in the show notes as well. It's free. You're just basically using any mobile device that you have that has a camera, and it's a quick formative assessment tool by students holding up a picture, a QR code card. So something to check out if you're interested in that is a quick formative assessment tool. In another manner, we will post the show link to that. And then, Dan, I had to put this Google Workspace update because we always talk about Sheets. Remember how we expand the cells and the rows? And so now we're expanding the power of Google Sheets with localized formatting and improved CSV imports. So basically, it's going to be a gradual rollout. For rapid release and scheduled release, it starts on February 7th, and it's available to everyone. But basically, it's going to make your life easier.
Oh, it is. I like how it's going to, use some new things just to make it more functional in the area in which you live and work.
Correct. And as we talk about commas and decimals and semicolons as your text separators, based on your region and where it's going to know you set the settings, it'll automatically filter it and put it in the correct format for you. So, all right, let's get to the main topic for this week. Dan's favorite movie store that we've talked about for a while is Blockbuster Video. There is one in Bend, Oregon. Dan ran 3,500 miles last year, as you know, so he will run to it this year and return, possibly.
I think I'll get some late fees.
It'll be like Forrest Gump. But let's talk Breaking the Blockbuster Model, and we talked a little bit about this overall. It's using EdTech and accessibility to see what's next in classrooms. And the author is Nate Ridgway, and he is a teacher in Indianapolis, Indiana, and the author of Breaking the Blockbuster Model. And he's talking about rethinking what teaching is and can be together. And we, Dan, had the great opportunity to have a conversation with Nate and interview him. So that is coming up next. All right, so Dan and I are very fortunate this week to have Nate Ridgway, the author of Breaking the Blockbuster Model, using EdTech and accessibility to see what's next in classrooms with us. Nate, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
We can't thank you enough for being with us today, Nate. So let's get started. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I'm an educator from Indianapolis, Indiana. Originally, I started off as a special education teacher in a middle school setting. But I also had, in college, majored as a history educator. And so I went on to do that for 8 more years, got my master's in history. In the meantime, I also dabbled quite a bit in EdTech and also in UDL, which is a philosophy called Universal Design for Learning, if your listeners are unfamiliar.
Sure, yeah. Yep.
While I was up to all that, I was able to write a couple of books. The first was basically kind of a precursor in a sense to Breaking the Blockbuster Model, which was called Don't Ditch That Tech, which looked at how we can use technology to differentiate for students in the classroom. And then this most recent one kind of takes a look more of an instructional focus on things. Since then, I've actually transitioned out of the classroom, but I'm still working with educators across the state of Indiana and also the United States writ large.
Oh, great. Thanks, Nate. So in teaching, have you always been teaching in the middle school?
So I taught actually in middle school for, 2 years, and then I transitioned into high school for the rest of my history teaching time.
All right. Well, I'm just saying I'm a history teacher as well. I started out at the high school and I moved to the middle school. And I had to say,
there you go.
I love those middle school years. People think it's crazy, but I embrace it.
It takes a certain kind of crazy to enjoy it. So.
Absolutely. So I know those experiences have framed a lot from me. So I'm sure it has for you. Can you describe your approach to teaching and what you feel makes it unique?
Yeah. So for me, my approach to teaching has always been based upon the idea. I think there are kind of several philosophical kind of underpinnings of my approach to to pedagogy. One is just a very deep, profound belief in meeting students where they are. And a lot of this is just I see it as like a very kind of like purposeful empathy. That doesn't mean that, that I'm not going to, hold students accountable, when that needs to be done. But, that comes from my background in UDL, but then also, Carolyn Tomlinson's work in differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of time with educators and professors who I worked with, on pedagogies ranging from Paulo Freire to Vygotsky, to, looking at, really how we think about, meeting students where they are and where we want to get them to go. So that's kind of like the first leg, I would say, of how I teach. The second, kind of complementing that belief in accessibility and, in differentiation and support is also, meeting, kind of all of that, kind of marinating that with an EdTech focus. And the reason why I became such a big, heavy user of educational technology in the classroom was simply because of, one, efficiency. It's an amazing time saver. And anything that I, believe that I can use to take stuff off of my plate is, in my opinion, a good thing.
Agreed.
Second, I think also there are opportunities that EdTech can really help make a much more authentic educational experience than worksheeting kids to death, for example.
Agreed.
And I think then it also presents opportunities for students to be able to present things and show off their knowledge in ways that they cannot do if you kind of restrict yourself simply to a pencil and paper, kind of platform. I think that all being said, though, I'm also a very big proponent of not just using EdTech because it exists.
Right.
It's a tool and it has to be used very purposefully. So again, trying to take kind of a very practical, but then kind of deep, empathetic look at how we can make education a more kind of comprehensive and just solid experience for students overall.
Thank you for sharing that. And, for those listeners that have read your book, or I hopefully will read your book, you can totally see that running theme go throughout your entire book for Breaking the Blockbuster Model. And one of the things as I was reading it and even hearing you speak about now is the importance of UDL and having that always in your mind as you're designing instruction really creates a lot of opportunities for students to provide those scaffolds and provide opportunities to meet them where they're at and get them to where they need to be. And, as you mentioned, I think something that we always say is EdTech needs to be purposeful. So when that technology can enhance the experience for those students and provide those opportunities for multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement, it gives you that, it takes up that heavy lift for you as a teacher. That EdTech can really change that instructional dynamic in your classroom because it makes it more attainable.
And I think too, a big mistake that happens with a lot, I see this a lot with pre-service teachers, and I ran into this when I, was doing my first years of teaching, is that we oftentimes think of making materials or activities or, whatever it is, right? Differentiation or, the structure of your classroom. We tend to think of looking at those as almost like an afterthought.
Right.
In the curriculum development process, it's oh, okay, cool. I've created this lesson now. Could I create a couple of different outcomes now, that my, for example, if I were going to be differentiating based off of, product, right? What my students are going to be making. Let me think about that now. I think that's actually completely backwards. I think for me, I start with thinking about that from the get-go, about, whether it's process, product, or, different students' backgrounds that they're bringing. That for me is a consideration from the very beginning. And I would encourage, as folks become more comfortable with thinking about how to, whether it's, differentiation or multicultural education or whatever they're looking at, that it starts to really become the filter, the kind of the lens that you see your instruction from its outset.
I think that's great, Nate. I really appreciate that. And things that resonate, I think, with all of our listeners and teachers and educators all over the world is the efficiency part of tech and the lens that you see it in and how you provide those opportunities to the students is really important. And, just going back, our first experience in getting to hear you speak and kind of interact was at a Ditch Summit, over a year ago, and coming out of the pandemic, and how we talked a lot at that time, how the pandemic provided us as educators with an opportunity to see where education is going, which we'll get back to that later with what's come out recently, but it did give us that opportunity. And from there, what inspired you to write Breaking the Blockbuster Model?
So for me, it was a couple of things. Like one, teaching through the pandemic was really hard.
Yeah.
Even for me, like as a very technologically savvy educator, it was very difficult. And a lot of it wasn't even around stuff with Edtech. It was like, all the schedule changes and things like that, right? So with my frustration with a lot of the stuff that I was seeing, that was definitely a motivating factor. The second thing, though, for me, was, and this kind of ties to that frustration, was that at that moment, then it was, I think like a lot of folks, it was a moment where it did allow us that moment to step back and say, okay, so why are we actually doing this? With whatever given issue was, we were looking at the time. Does it actually work if, we try this, process in class, right? And for me, a really, really funny example, this is the dress code. Was the dress code really important for us, to be considering in the middle of a pandemic? And I would argue no. No, I do not care if you, whatever you want to wear. Your priggings are not an issue right now. What I care about you is your worth as an individual.
Right. You don't care if they have pants on or not.
Yes. It's just please, if you can be here. If not, I hope you're healthy and you're learning. That's what I care about right now. So, I think that was part of it. I think too, though, the vast inequities that COVID exposed that were already there was another, extremely motivating factor for me. And I tried to write in the book about what existed just in alone in the Indianapolis area paradigm in terms of access to internet and equitable educations, in terms of how many teachers were able to get access to good PD before they were thrown into emergency remote teaching. So kind of all that came together. I think the last motivating factor, and this is why I'm actually going to be a little bit critical of myself here, is actually with my first book that I wrote. I co-wrote with my mom, who's a doctor in ed, and also Matt Miller, who's a much better author and much more famous than I am in terms of writing about these topics. I was frustrated with that book in a way because our first book, Don't Ditch That Tech, really looked at how we could differentiate the classroom with technology.
Right.
And I felt like, although that book was very successful as to some of the alternatives that it looked like and how we could make, certain activities more accessible, it didn't actually address one of the core problem, which I thought was looking at instruction itself and how that needed to be dynamically challenged. Not just, okay, you can wrap your instruction in a different, package in it, but it's still the same thing, whether that's, more teacher centric, paradigm or one that's more student driven. I wanted to really take some of those notions and push beyond them, in Breaking the Blockbuster Model. So all those kind of form the concoction, behind the motivating factor for that book. So.
I appreciate that, Nate. That is a great wrap up of where that inspiration came from, and really resonates with all the points that you were hitting home there. And the biggest thing that I want to take away for people as well is you're always self-reflecting, like you just did at the end. As educators, as people, anybody, across the world, self-reflection is a key component to see how can we do better or how can we attack things differently, whether it's for ourselves and our own lives or for our students, which we're impacting every day.
Yeah, for me, reflection I would argue it is probably the most important skill that I have developed over my time as an educator. I mean, you can't look at where you want to go if you can't look back at where you've been, right? So
great.
It's like there are, if ever, coming out of the pandemic, it is time to ask some very difficult questions about, what should come next with educational practices.
Totally agree with that. I always, say to myself is I have to constantly remind myself that I am a reflective practitioner, that I always need to go back and readjust and reevaluate. And thinking about readjusting and reevaluating and how we go forward. So, I mean, we all know the circumstances as we taught through the pandemic with remote and hybrid learning, but, now that things have moved back into the classroom and, things start moving forward. Have you seen any changes since, that has happened, since we've gotten back in terms of instruction and technology, or anything that's changed since maybe the release of your book?
Yes and no. I think I think that educators, I'll just give this example for Indiana, because I can speak to that really well. So here in Indiana, as you guys probably also had there in New York, we had snow days, right?
Yep.
And right around the time of the pandemic, they're like, maybe we can do e-learning days instead of snow days, right? So on its surface, they're like, well, hey, now kids can do stuff from home. However, and I can tell you this now, having a kindergartner who has attempted e-learning, just because you slap, an e-learning label on your snow day doesn't actually mean that you dynamically transformed the way that your students are learning during that experience. And I can attest to what happened to a lot of my kids in students, meaning coming out of the pandemic, is that when they would then get hit with these e-learning days, because they're like, schools are like, oh, this is now all possible. What they would do is they'd be like, well, let's treat it like a normal school day. Right. And so we're going to sit the kids in front of the computer for 7 hours straight, which is the equivalent of watching the entire, my nerd brain's Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, the trilogy.
Right? And nobody would ever sit there for 7 hours, watching a film series, unless they're a total nerd like me. So, that is a classic example of well, you thought you learned something, but I don't know if you actually, really actually adapted this and transformed it. I think, though, there's a difference between how some admin have handled the opportunities of the pandemic versus what some teachers have gained out of it. I think there have been, simply just from the exposure factor, there were teachers who were exposed to more tools that they could utilize because of COVID. That being said, though, I think the exposure that was given to teachers with that varied widely. And in some cases, you had some schools that were very hesitant to adopt some of these tools, and maybe appropriately so. 1 or 2 or 3 tools were found, and that served them really well, and they did, and their educators and their students did fine with it. Speaking to other teachers across the state and across the United States, they were just drowning in the amount of tools and apps that they were given. I was recently reading an article that talked about just the sheer number of apps that our students and teachers utilize on a given day. And I think the number was something around 65 now.
Yeah,
that's a lot.
Yeah. And it's just that's too much. So I think those have been some of the larger touch points and dynamics that I've observed, since the book has come out. That I could speak to.
That's great.
That's, and I would say we've witnessed a lot of that too as well. Coming out of the pandemic, a lot of the teachers that we work with, it was great because it great in the fact that the level of comfortability and using different technology platforms definitely increased overall, and allowed teachers to bring up that base where now they can think about using it for instruction. And so, you know, a lot of our PD and a lot of our work with teachers moved beyond just this is how you use a tool to really getting into the discussions of instruction and, you know, setting out your goals and what you'd like students to understand and the skills you'd like to do and how that technology can help you get there. The one thing that we did notice is shortly after the pandemic, a lot of teachers kind of, and I totally get it with good reason, said I need to be out of the digital space for a while. And I totally agree with that. And we moved through, and now we're at a point now where it's coming back around. And the one thing that, you know, I can see in your book that I personally took a lot from your book was that moment where you talk about designing your instruction for your digital space to use it in your physical space in the classroom.
Right.
And those possibilities had really, you know, it struck a chord with me, but as we move through our PD and we go through conversations with different teachers, bringing it from that point of view has been eye-opening for a lot of people, seeing the opportunities now where you can, you know, really plan your differentiation, your scaffolds, everything you need in your digital space, and then bring equity into the classroom as you're using it in your physical space. So that's really fantasc.
Without spoiling everything and too much.
I'm sorry about that.
No, you're totally fine. I will say, without spoiling everything too much, you know, the book is basically broken up into 3 sections, I guess, chapters. It's actually a bit more than that, but the last model that I talk about in the book is the streaming model.
Yep.
And in that one, the trend you're referring to there, for those who haven't had the chance to read yet, is called cloning. And for me, like, cloning is something that I piloted back before the pandemic, so I had about 5 years of it under my belt before the pandemic really hit. And I will say that single-handedly probably saved my sanity while teaching through the pandemic, where, like, I mean, because at one point we were on 9 different schedules with students, and I didn't know students I was going to have at a given day. And so just like knowing, so the idea behind the cloning model, again, for those who haven't read, is that like your in-person experience is cloned digitally as close as possible to the ones that students can access online. And that was an absolute lifesaver for me from a time efficiency standpoint, because I didn't have to go and make 10 different versions of myself, in case a kid was out, or they had to provide childcare for their family. And I will say that I was recently at a Teach Better conference in Ohio, and I had a lady who came up to me and said that approach worked wonders for her in her classroom, and just going there was just absolutely made my day. To hear that approach had worked for somebody else too. So.
That's great. You talk about the efficiency, and we're going to get into more of the models, in a minute. I know Dan's got a couple questions, in regards to that. Obviously, you've been a big proponent when we talked about don't ditch that tech and Edtech overall. Do you have a specific aha moment, right, when the light bulb goes on, when you realize the power of Edtech in instruction?
Oh, yeah, all the time. For me, it's you kind of just walking around a classroom, you can kind of see it in students' eyes as to whoa, we can actually do this right now. There's so many different examples of this I could bring up, but one is I was having my students, this is a couple months ago, they were mapping the route that they thought that humans took to get to the Americas for indigenous peoples. And so I had students on Pear Deck drawing on top of a map that I had put on a slide deck. And they were just able to draw the route that they thought and predict. And then just simply being able to be to display students' answers up on the screen within seconds. And, being able to digest some of the, misconceptions that they had and talk about what more recent science has, and archaeology has determined that you can instantly and much more quickly have effective conversations with students with some of the technologies that are out there right now compared to what I would be able to do in the past.
Yeah, and it's great. I mean, to try to keep up, like you said, the 65 tools at any point, it's a lot to keep track of all the tools, and you have to, it's making sure you're using what works best for you and your students with your outcomes. That's really what it comes down to, and Pear Deck is a great example right in there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So just to get back to the book again, and I don't want to give away too much because everyone should be.
You got to sell copies.
Everyone should read this book,
Yeah.
especially the way it's put together, and you explain everything and your graphics and your details and your plot points and your plot twists. I love it.
And Blockbuster as a whole.
Right. After I read the book, Andrew and I thought we should plan a road trip to Bend, Oregon to see the last remaining Blockbuster.
I know there's still one there. Yeah.
But you talk about different models of instruction in the Blockbuster model. Can you just briefly discuss the different models that you go through in the book?
Yeah. So I decided early on that I kind of wanted to turn the book into something that not just a book about accessibility, but I wanted the book itself to be accessible, right? And so I thought about something that, folks could relate to easily, and that I felt like was movies and video and film. Like we all are very large content consumers. So that was kind of a medium that I thought that we could, use to kind of discuss some of the paradigms with instruction. So in terms of how the book breaks down, so we first take a look at what I call the movie theater model. And the movie theater model is really predicated upon a very traditional kind of stance on education. And for me, the movie theater model really breaks down to a couple of very central ideas. One, that being that lessons are very centered on lecture. And it's a very kind of teacher-centric notion of the classroom. So the teachers, determine what skills are important, what content is important. And if we think about that and kind of like how that translates into a movie theater, then it's pretty similar, right? Movies determine what, movie theaters determine what movies are going to be available, no matter how good or bad they are. It's kind of like the Oscars, right? It's like, you don't, it's not going to be the community that's going to pick. It's going to be, that certain group of people, right? That's going to deem that this is the best and that's what you're going to watch. I think the other thing about the movie theater model that's really important to understand is that, and lectures fall prey to this quite a bit, but not always, is that they are very, very restricted in terms of accessibility. You have to be there at a certain time. There's no pausing or rewinding. You have to go to the bathroom or you miss something. I can't remember the last time that I was at a movie theater and there were subtitles on. So there was a lot of restrictions there in terms of, in terms of linguistics and lingual learners that could be discussed. So for me, the movie theater model has got some serious problems, but it's not like we should toss it all out. It just needs some serious renovation. The movie theaters do. I actually shared in the book like a picture of the first Nickelodeon in the United States in Pittsburgh. Yeah. And it looks very similar to a movie theater nowadays, just without, the spine, shaking subwoofers. It's pretty much the exact same. And so for me, I think what I try to do in the book is show about some techniques that we can employ to try to kind of renovate those movie theaters and make them more effective for our students when they need to be used. Because there are times where, we do need to do a short mini lesson here or there, and that is the most effective way of delivering content. So
that's awesome.
That's kind of the movie theater model. I can go on to the next one if you would like me to, or we can take some time and discuss that one if you'd like.
I think we can go on to the next one. I mean, the one thing with the movie theater experience too, and that you bring up in the book, is there is a place for it and a very valuable place for it in instruction. But you do mention we can do a better job with it, especially thinking about the other models that come after it. So maybe we can just transition into the Blockbuster model.
Yeah. So the Blockbuster model then takes some of the inspiration then from the movie theater model of that very kind of lecturer centric, teacher centric kind of skills, and it looks more at the practices then that are surrounding that dynamic. And for me, like, since it is the heart of the book, the Blockbuster model for me is like all those things that, like, as a student that you would always like to traditionally count on being there. Like, right. I always thought as a kid growing up in the 90s, like, oh, Blockbuster, like that'll be there in 2020. Yeah. It'll still be around. And then, of course, things happen, right? And so, like, for me, it's like textbooks, right? Are a classic example of something that we find in the Blockbuster model. The idea that there always is going to be homework, right? That, like, it's these very core notions of, if I were to step into most teachers' classrooms, I would see some elements of those kind of bits and pieces of instruction. I think that there are some things that Blockbuster did that were revolutionary for its time. And this is something actually that I try to talk about in the book, that, that there were some things that Blockbuster did really well, such as, like, for example, that, you could now start to think beyond about, I have to always go to a movie theater, consume content. I can go and I can take it home and I can consume it at my own time, right? Whether that's a 3-day rental or a 5-day rental, right? Or whatever odd things that are there. The thing is, though, is that I think that Blockbuster revealed, and in itself, the actual physical Blockbuster, but also the Blockbuster classrooms writ large, they revealed some very troublesome philosophical underpinnings about instruction, about how we conceive of that. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The one that I would target immediately is grading. And Blockbuster, to be honest, and they would freely admit this, at least the one store left would, is that they actually did not care if you turned your movies in on time. And the reason was because they cared about profit, right? And for me, grading / late work is very much the same thing. The effect that late work and grading has on students, and this has been very heavily dived into, and I tried to, as much as possible, parse through some of the research in the book, is that has an extremely destructive effect on students. And the idea of David Frangosia wrote about, I had him contribute a blurb on this, and there, amongst others, and just the effect that this has on motivation is extremely, extremely potent. And if you think about it, just kind of put it in Blockbuster terms, you would get, like, let's say you would rent a DVD and then you would, not think about it for a couple weeks, right? The number one thing you're not going to go do is you're not going to go back to the Blockbuster to go, because you know what's waiting for you. Right, it's waiting for you, right? And so Blockbuster memberships are, late work is the Blockbuster memberships that our students never wanted or never asked for. And that, for me, it's an extremely problematic practice that has to be looked at very purposely and very decisively because of the effect that it has on kids and their motivation. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. I was just saying, I totally agree with everything that you're saying. And then, I think about, like, that Blockbuster experience. One of the things that you look at in the classroom, it is revolutionary for a lot of ways, but still it was contained to everything. Like, you were only allowed to see what was in the Blockbuster store and what was in the Blockbuster store at that time. I remember looking at the Blockbuster experience, and and one of the things, like, I have that nostalgic feeling. It's like you go in and there's a movie you really want to see, and and it's not there.
Right.
it's taken out, and then
And
you're
that's
that
not how kids operate today, right?
And I was that person that would go up to the counter and be like, "Can you go through the return bin,
Right,
and see if that movie's there? Because I really want to watch it." And then it wouldn't be there, and then I'd have to wait. So, you think about that in the classroom, it's like you have differentiated materials, you have all those things, but they're only available when they're available. And that could be a turnoff for a lot of students.
Mm-hmm. And kids, like, not only can that be incredibly demotivating, but also, like, kids are going to find the content, whatever it is. So in my mind, since being an educator, I can help them, parse through, difficult things to think about, especially as like a history teacher. That was something I had to be, really careful of, especially in the current political, environment that, like, okay, like, I know my kids are going to find the content, so let me take the time to help them deconstruct it and critically think about it, and make that accessible to them so that they, that I can capture that motivation.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads into the final model, right, when we talk about streaming. So can you give a synopsis of the streaming model? I know you touched upon it a little bit, earlier on in the interview, but since we've already now talked in the book about the first two models, Nate, can you just expand upon that?
Yeah, so the streaming model is kind of like, for me, it is closer to where I think things should be going in terms of educational practices, but I don't think it's all the way there yet, and I can give some examples of that as well. So the first idea of the streaming model is that, that the idea, and I mentioned it earlier, that classrooms can have this clone that can be accessed anywhere, anytime. And this is something that streaming services today are so good at doing. It's like, oh, do you want to watch, all of, the White Lotus in your hot tub? Sure, go for it. Watch it on your phone. And then it's like, oh, now you're on a Peloton. Do you want to watch, Succession there? Sure, do it. It's something that streaming platforms are so good at addressing right now, is meeting viewers and users where they are and where they honestly want to be. And for me, that was extremely important that over time that I developed that capacity as an educator. And there's lots of ways that I talk about doing that as a book, whether it's, taking the occasional 10 or 15 minutes there to record my instruction, and then boom, kids can go back and they can use that anytime they want to, right, to help in their learning. There's, so that's kind of the first component. The second thing is kind of looking at the content that is in your class itself, and from the content, and the skills that are in your classroom itself. And so this is something that I pushed very heavily in my classroom, is that I tried to the greatest degree possible to not only have the and teachers do such a good job of this anyway, but I was just trying to be very intentional about doing it, is that taking whatever content or skill area that I had and then being able to tie that to things that extended beyond my classroom. So, for example, I sat down at the beginning of every year and I taught students how their brains actually learn. And the amount of times that I would run into students and I would always serve them at the beginning of the year, I would probably have 75 to 80% of students who had never been taught how to take notes with the brain in mind, or how to study with educational psychology in mind. They were always just told, go study. And taking time to actually break down those underlying hidden practices with kids are really, really important. And then the ability, kind of by extension then, to link that to other things that they're interested in, by proxy, also extremely powerful. And there's a really good example of this that I can probably give very quickly. And that is on Prime. Amazon Prime has this called X-Ray. It's this little X-Ray feature they have, where if you're watching a movie or a film, and they're like, by the way, did you see that in this scene? And it was a goof or something, right? But then they also have stuff like fun facts, oh yeah, by the way, did you notice in the scene that these two actors appear here? They also appeared in this film together, and you might be interested in that. You should totally go watch it. And that's something that I tried to imbue in my classroom as much as possible, where instead of thinking about our curriculum as, linear units, that we start to more think about it as student driven content from choices that they can make. Right. And this is something, again, that streaming practices do so well. It's like, oh, you super enjoyed Yellowstone.
Talk my language.
What else is like that you would totally dig? And that's something, again, that I think that we need to capture more as educators. Right. And then the last bit of the streaming model is that, again, kind of thinking about that Blockbuster model as well, is that we shift away from thinking about our relationships in the classroom as transactional, which Blockbuster was all about. It's like, this is a classroom of accountability. And we more think of our classrooms as places focused on growth and relationships. Because ultimately I would argue, and I think most educational theorists out there would argue, is that if you really want to enact change in kids, it doesn't come from policies and transactions. It comes from relationships and reflection and growth. And so that is something that I think, again, part of the streaming model, and something that those programs and platforms do so well, is they are constantly thinking about what they can do better to kind of develop their apps and viewing experiences for people.
Well, you bring up the idea of relationships and growth, and we've been having that conversation a lot lately in the face of what a lot of educators are dealing with now, with the massive, I don't even know how to say it, the AI that's been generated, especially everything with ChatGPT, and how teachers are going to deal with that. And we're really talking about relationships and growth. How do you see education evolving with the emergence of AI, specifically things like ChatGPT or DALL-E or anything that you may have seen?
Yep. So the first thing is to realize is you have to tell your kids it's a tool, like any other tool, right? There are times where it's okay to use, and there are times when it's not okay to use. And that really is going to depend on very specific circumstances in your instruction, right? However, having a conversation about how students use it versus how teachers use it is a little bit different and a little bit nuanced. I think, one, for teachers, if you are designing assignments, and this for a lot of teachers is their first concern. It's like, what if my students cheat? Really, I would tell any teacher that I've worked with, and this is what I've always said to other teachers I've done work with in professional development, is that if your assignment can be done and accomplished through an app like ChatGPT or any whether it was, in any number of apps that were out there where you could have other people, write for you. If your assignment is able to be done by an AI, you're probably not designing a great authentic assessment of what your kids actually know.
Right.
And the reason why I say that is writing, sure, you're like, but wait, those AI can sound like them and they can write like them. Yes and no. It was always so obvious for my kids when in those instances that I had where a student had copied something from online. And again, this is, when I was having them, type stuff out of a document, it was always so obvious from them when it wasn't their authentic writing, because I knew my kids really, really well.
Right.
And that, I think, is also one of the first keys that it comes to when talking with your kids about a tool like this, which is one, like ChatGPT, as hard as you try, it's not going to sound exactly like you. I know your voice. I know what you know, and relationships are going to be your first key to kids with that in mind, right? The second thing with relationships with AI and how that's used is, and I told my kids this when, stuff that was as simple as bathroom breaks, which is you're on the trust bicycle until you fall off of it. And, which, it's a cheesy, but it worked.
Right.
And that is, I trust you, with a tool like this, or going to the bathroom when like you say, yeah, Mr. Ridgway, I need to go to the bathroom. I'm like, cool, go. Awesome. I trust you until I find out that I can't trust you anymore,
Sure.
With a tool like that. And then it kind of comes down to, I think instead of thinking about ChatGPT and AI, if we can kind of move beyond the grading concern, which for a lot of people is a very legitimate one, and I understand that. If you can start thinking about, designing assessments that can't be ChatGPT'd, such as, having your kids respond on Flipgrid, or, having, them do activities in class that are them talking with each other, and something that can't be replicated with AI. If you can get beyond that, then we can actually start to think about how we can really purposefully use it in class. So like a really classic example that I had students do, this was last March or April, because that's when I get into my civil rights unit in second semester of U.S. history. Is I had students write for me what they thought the story of the civil rights movement was, and when they thought the civil rights movement started. And so a really interesting way that I would love to do that, if I were to do that activity again this year, is to have students use ChatGPT and ask it, what happened in the civil rights movement? Or when did it start? And I had kids saying, oh yeah, the civil rights movement, started, and I'm sure this is what ChatGPT would, spit out. The civil rights movement started in the 1950s and the 1960s, with figures like Martin Luther King. You get these really, very classic narrative answers, right? And what I did with my kids then in that unit, and what I would probably do this time around, is I would say, okay, we had a person submit this as a response. This is what was generated online. What's the problem with this? And we can actually start to hold those answers up, or an AI generated answer up that's been, created by students, and we can start to pick them apart. Mm-hmm. And so we can, for example, and I had my students do this, and I said, okay, so really, when did the struggle against, when did struggles over race begin in the United States? And they were like, oh, okay, well, let me think about that. I was like, wait, what about the Civil War, Mr. Ridgway? I'm like, yeah, that's 1861. That's way before 1960 and 1950. They're like, well, I was like, well, when did the first slaves arrive in the United States? And they're like, oh, crud, that was 1619, Mr. Ridgway. So they start going back and they start revising and rethinking their answers. And so there's a way, I think, with ChatGPT and other AI that we can hold it up, because, again, AI is simply a reflection of human intelligence, right? But we know that human intelligence can be it can be misconceived, and it can fall prey to mistakes, right? And to misconceptions that have happened. And so for me as a history educator, looking at what everybody thinks are true, or things that, people consider to be a narrative that's dominant, would be a fascinating way to use a tool like that. That for me is I think there's kind of, again, different tacks to approach the topic of AI generally. One is, yes, think about the grading part of it, that's something very important to you, but also think about how your instruction should maybe change to adapt to, tools like that.
Right.
And then second, think about how you can flip it and use it as something that can empower you as an educator. If that means that you're like, hey, ChatGPT, please save me 20 minutes and write me a blurb about back to school night that I can use. Absolutely use it. I mean, of course, proofread it. Just don't, send it out without actually reading it. But, use the tools that are available there to you, but help students understand them in the context of their creation and their appropriateness of use. That would be kind of my spiel on it.
That's great, Nate.
That's great. And, I always look at this quote that you have at the end of your book, where breaking the blockbuster model means not just thinking about what the future holds, but designing what we as teachers want the future to be. So, I mean, when you wrote that, you probably didn't have this idea of AI in mind, but it's there. And, what it goes back to is you talk about redesigning learning experiences and then embracing that digital space to provide opportunities for more creativity, more collaboration, more authentic, more performance-based assessment, it's, that's really where we need to look to as educators. Like, all right, if we're going to really reevaluate our instruction, we need to really reevaluate the way we deliver instruction in order to provide those opportunities for authenticity in the classroom.
Yeah, and Nate, what I wanted to say is I love how the book really ended. I know Dan gave that one quote, but something that really resonated with me was we're all forced to innovate and make leaps into the unknown. And right now, the use of AI, ChatGPT, Google's version that's coming out, all of that is that risk taking, right? And you said the way you closed it was the riskiest thing that we could do, though, is if we want to improve educational equity and accessibility, is taking no risk at all. So taking no risk into the AI world is only going to set us back. We have to pivot just like we have with other things that have changed, and we have to get ready to kind of buckle up and get ready for the ride like it's a roller coaster, because we don't know where it's going to go. And we're having this conversation in February. Who knows where it's going to be in September? But we do appreciate your time today and all of that. Where can listeners find you online and learn more about you and grab a copy of your books, Don't Ditch That Tech and Breaking the Blockbuster Model? Where can all of our listeners find you, Nate?
Yeah, so there's probably two locations that I can point people towards.
Awesome.
The first is the website for the book itself, which is breakingblockbuster.com.
Great.
Easy to find. The book is there. You can get it on paperback or Kindle on Amazon. I think there's also a link there where people can read the preface for free just by punching in their email, so they can get a piece of it. And then the second place is on Twitter. We're not my mom, who I've collaborated with on a couple books. We actually, it's quite adorable. Share a Twitter account there, but I promise it is me. And we're available there at Teach from Ridge, and you can find us there.
That's great. Nate, we can't thank you enough for your time and your expertise and sharing all of your knowledge and foresight with the book and where education's going, and a quick recap of all the models. Anybody, you got to read the book. It's really eye-opening.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your guys' time and the chance to speak with you guys about it.
Thanks again, Nate.
Thank you, Nate.
Dan, that was a very insightful interview with Nate.
Yes, thanks again to Nate for joining us on this. It was so much fun to further our conversation about technology and instruction and just good teaching.
Yeah, the digital environments, everything. There's something that everybody can take away from that interview that is meaningful to your own instruction and pedagogy as you move forward throughout your educational career, whether you're a new teacher or a seasoned teacher. There's something that you can definitely take away. So that is going to wrap up episode 39. Dan, any final thoughts?
Nope. Thanks. Just as always, thanks again to all of our listeners, and please keep giving us the feedback.
That's it. The sticker request, we'll post that link on the show notes as well. Thank you for all your support, listening on those platforms, leaving those reviews, as Dan had mentioned. Questions, comments, suggestions, reach out, hit us up on the socials. Tech hard, work smart, live in Edventure.
Find Andrew on all socials at @NicolaTech and Dan at WCSD Tech DR.